Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Margie Parker Lamparillo, and I'm part of the Learning and Development team here at the 4As. We are moving right along in our Mastering Workplace Conversations series, and pleased to welcome our thought leader today, Michele Prota, here, who is going to present the webinar, Decoding and Converging Feedback. Michele is driven by creating employee experiences that fuel creativity, and in her role as Global Chief Talent Officer at KBS, she is tasked with reimagining each touchpoint that existing and future employees experience at KBS. But before we start and I hand it over to Michele, I just wanted to go through some logistics for you so that you can maximize your learning experience here today. First, know that you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if on your end you're experiencing any viewing problems for the presentation on your computer, it could be a security block or a security wall on your end, and you may have to deal with that with your IT person. But if you need to contact us via email during this webinar for any technical issues, send that email to webinar@aaaa.org, and we'll help you if there's any technical issues. If for any reason during this webinar you guys get disconnected, just go back to the email invitation and log in again through your link. We want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so we'll be throwing a few polls your way throughout this. Keep an eye out for that. We'd really appreciate your participation with that. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have a few minutes for questions. However, please feel free to send us your questions as we go through the webinar. You'll see that there's a questions box on your go-to panel towards the bottom of that, and that's where you will type and submit any questions you'd like to ask Michele. And last but not least, we ask you guys to live tweet during the webinar, and don't forget to add our hashtag it's hashtag 4As webinars and our handle @4As Learning. And now please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Michele.
Hi everyone, Michele Prota here. Welcome to Mastering Workplace Conversation, Decoding and Converging Feedback. That's me, Michele Prota. I'm the head of talent for KBS globally, and I'm super excited to present this to you. That's my Twitter handle. If you'd like to get in touch, please feel free to do so at Michele M. Prota. And let's get started. Thank you to the 4As for continuously supporting our career development, and to K and Black for their partnership in this presentation. Today, we'll be discussing the importance of feedback in the workplace and how to deliver and receive feedback effectively. So first, let's set the table. When you look up the definition of feedback, this is what you'll find. Feedback is information about or reactions to a product or a person's performance used as a basis for improvement. If you are to remember anything from this next hour, remember that feedback is given only to improve. And if we look at the history of feedback, it's been on the rise continuously since its origination in 1919. What I'd like you to pay particular attention to is the increase after the year 2000, which wholly defines our workforce today, where creating workplaces rich in feedback is definitely here to stay. So let's go over the goals of today and what we'll be discussing. After today, you will be able to understand the art of giving and receiving feedback and why it's important to business. You'll understand why actively listening and being empathetic in the workplace is crucial. You'll have the tools to give feedback productively, and you'll be prepared more than you are right now to accept feedback gracefully. So first, let's get started with our first poll. I'd love to get an understanding from you on how you feel when you hear the word feedback. Excited, curious, nervous, or scared? We can take a couple of minutes to hear your responses. How do you feel when you hear the word feedback? Okay, we'll wait a couple more seconds. And then for the 4As, I just want to make sure that I can see everybody's responses. I don't see responses at the moment. I want to make sure that we're able to share that back with everybody.
Yeah, I'm looking at this. I'm not seeing responses yet. So guys, if on your end you are responding, just shoot that to me in a chat box, please. And I'm going to close this poll now in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Michele?
Yep.
We did not receive any input. I think it's a technical issue on my end. I'm going to look through it. So perhaps you could just kind of go through what you generally hear. Okay.
No worries. Moving right along. I know, as the head of talent in my experience, this is what I often hear from employees. I hear, am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong? And from managers, I'll often hear, I'm not looking forward to having this conversation, or I'm afraid to do this because I think this person may get defensive. So I think already we can tell a couple of minutes into this webinar that there's some negativity around the idea of feedback, right? And if it's so crucial to your career success and the company's success, but most of the feelings tend to be negative, we already know that often in the workplace, feedback is not that productive. Another misconception is that we only give feedback with the words that we use. But the truth is that we're giving feedback all the time. When we speak with the words and the tones that we use, when we listen with our body language, even by the posture and our physical presence. So next up, we'll go through each of these to review how we could better understand ourselves, to evaluate how we're showing up for our clients, our colleagues, our employees, and our bosses every day at work. So first, tone. Let's explore how our voice affects people when we speak, right? So imagine you are stepping out of a creative review where you're preparing for a big client presentation the next morning, and your manager takes you aside and says the following. Now, I will say a sentence in 2 different ways to show you how tone can affect feedback. Michele, can we talk about the last round of creative? Versus, Michele, can we talk about the last round of creative? Already the modulation in my voice sets up the conversation to be perceived by the listener as negative or positive. Second, word choice is really important. Inclusive words are empowering. So imagine your boss is providing you feedback, and they say to you things like, together we can figure out how to best position our Q4 scope, or I'm confident that you can attend the pitch without me, or let's talk about how to present this idea more effectively. When someone is giving you feedback and you are part of the solution and they are partnering with you, you're engaged, you're excited. However, inclusive choices are disempowering and can often be perceived as accusatory. So imagine the same boss in the same scenario, but you hear things like, you always get quiet when we discuss budgets, or you never speak up when clients are in the room, or you have to present the ideas more effectively, or you should have asked for help sooner if you were stuck. That makes you feel lonely, like you have no help and you're not sure how to get over this hurdle of feedback that was just presented to you. The next is silence. So what about when you ask your manager for time off? This happens a lot of time, right? You ask your manager for time off, and they either don't ever respond over email to your request, or there's a really long pause before they approve your time off. This would leave you probably feeling that taking vacation time wasn't welcome, regardless of whether the answer at the end of the day was yes or no. Or what if during a brainstorm you finally get the guts up to share that great idea and then no one in the room replies? I expect that would make you feel like your idea was bad, but unfortunately, due to silence, you aren't sure why. And the last nonverbal that we'll explore is body language. And if anyone has seen Ann Cuddy's famous TED Talk on this, you already know that this can be the most powerful means of communication. And we see it every day. The disengaged employees are slouching in their seats. They look tired. They look annoyed. They're on their phones when people are talking. And then engaged employees have their phones down. They're sitting up straight. They're making eye contact. They're seemingly interested and engaged. And often these people are perceived as problem solvers. So now that we understand that feedback is everywhere, let's explore why this is so important at work. I love this quote by Theodore Roosevelt that nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And another great quote that I needed to share with you was also by Maya Angelou, which I'm sure that you have heard before, and that's, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. When we feel included in feedback and engaged in workplace conversation, we feel that our work counts towards a higher purpose, that our performance matters even when the feedback is constructive, and it makes us feel valuable to our company, not ignored. And when we receive regular feedback, we become more engaged at work, which is proven to be good for business. We're more productive, we're happier, we're effective collaborators, and we're more creative. Conversely, a lack of feedback is bad for business. Lower profitability, lower job growth, lower share price, and more turnover. So now that we know that feedback is in everything that we do, and it's good for us, and it's good for companies, how do we become great at this whole feedback thing? First, by active listening. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of active listening before, but it's probably the opposite of what we think about when we think about giving feedback. Active listening, once mastered, is really a superpower in the workplace. So there are 3 different types of listening that we engage in every single day that are shallow all the way to deep listening. So we will start with internal listening, which tends to be the most shallow. So we'll talk about that one first. Internal listening is whereby when someone is speaking to you, you're listening, but you're actually just hearing the sounds of your own inner voice. Your attention is on yourself. You hear the words of the other person, but you're primarily aware of your own opinions, your own stories, your own feelings, or your own needs, right? So there's a lot of head nodding that happens during internal listening, and there's a lot of and a lot of thoughts like, I'm hungry. When was the last time that I ate? Or I really need to get home to watch my show. Or this conversation's really starting to bore me. Or I'm terrified I'm going to say the wrong thing and look stupid. So in thinking about what internal listening is, I'd love to engage you on a second poll. How often do you experience or observe internal listening in the workplace? Most of the time, sometimes, or never? Let's give you a couple of seconds.
Okay, we figured out the technical issues on our end, and people are voting. And we have 100% participation, so I'm going to close the poll now and share the results out. There you go, Michele. 100%.
I actually don't see them. Maybe you can share the responses with me? Maybe you can share the responses with me?
Sure. So our audience has said 100% B sometimes.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. I expected that. So that's really great to hear. And I think, you know, there are a lot of articles and there's a lot of articles and information out in the world about why this is true, right? We're constantly on our phone. We are engaging with a lot of different things at one time. So I think, you know, pay attention to the meetings that you're in over the course of the next few days, and sadly, you'll see a lot of this, right? The second level The second level of listening, which is a bit more deeper, is focused listening. Focused listening is being able to focus on the other person, but you're still not connecting to them fully. The phone may be down and you may be nodding in agreement, but you may not be picking up on the small nuances that the person is sharing. You're hearing everything, though, that the person says. So real quick, a second poll. How often do you experience or observe focused listening in the workplace? Most of the time, sometimes, or never?
Everyone is voting. We're at 20% participation, 40, 60%. There's some more votes out there, I know it. Okay, I'm going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to share it. Michele, in case you can't see it on your end, the results are 25% of our participants experience that A, most of the time, and 75% fall into option B, sometimes.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you can see there's a real opportunity. So far, we're listening, but we're not engaging in conversation. Or in the case of internal listening, we're really only paying attention to ourselves. So active listening takes in everything. You're aware of the energy between you and the other person. You're also aware of how that energy is changing. You detect sadness or lightness or shifts in attitude. You're aware of the environment and whatever is going on in the environment that could be affecting the conversation. You're conscious of the underlying mood or the tone or the impact of the conversation. You know, a really good example of active listening is stand-up comedians. Stand-up comedians have a highly developed sense of listening. They know where their humor is landing and when it isn't. And this level of listening is where your intuition is the most available to you. So think about your interactions over the last 2.5 days this week at work. And for the final poll in this section, how often do you experience or observe true active listening at work? Most of the time, sometimes, or never?
The poll is opening and everybody is voting now. We're at 60%. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the results are, for the audience, Michele, A, most of the time is at 25%, and B, sometimes 75% of our audience, same as last time.
Wonderful, wonderful. So for those that feel like they are engaging in active conversation all the time at work, that's wonderful to hear. And hopefully this webinar can give you a couple of tricks to move the people who are mostly in the sometimes bucket to most of the time. So now that we know that there's an energy in active listening and you're aware of the environment and the implications of the conversation, I did want to raise just a couple of active listening traps that people often can fall into, right? So let's talk about what active listening is not. The first misstep when it comes to active listening is the idea of listening to talk. Stephen Covey, the great management leader and author, famously wrote that, quote unquote, most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. And I think we all know what this looks like and also feels like it works. This is the person who should be actively listening during a conversation, but is jumping out of their seat because they can't wait to say their piece, right? Often these people interrupt the person speaking because they can't wait any longer, right? So that's the first trap. The second one is what I like to call listening gold medalists. This is where we become overly concerned with how to engage in active listening, that we become frustrated when every single conversation that we partake in is not absolutely transformative. There's a little bit of internal listening that happens here as well, right, where we're saying, while the person's talking to us, am I actively listening? Can they tell that I'm actively listening? Am I being aware of what's going on around us? How's this person feeling, right? And you're doing so much evaluation of the conversation that you aren't necessarily present. And then the last trap is what I call interrogation, right? So active listening, to be clear, does not mean asking a lot of questions, right? Sometimes people fall in this trap of attempting to engage the other person, but asking way too many detailed questions just to show that they're listening. But essentially, this doesn't show an emotional investment from the listener. So active listening creates space for the person who is speaking to add as much meaning as possible to the conversation. So active listening creates space for the person who's speaking to add meaning to the conversation. So let's give you some tips on how to engage in this. Use open-ended questions in the conversation. These are questions that allow the person speaking to add more to the story in a more meaningful way. The second is to seek stories from the person that can better help illustrate meaning to their story. And the easiest way to start doing this is to tack on the question why, to keep building on their story. And then the last one is to really listen and watch for feelings and emotions so that you can detect feelings of sadness or excitement or shifts in attitude. Now, the second way to become great at this at work is to be empathetic, right? To become more engaged and focus on empathy. Empathy is the ability to read and understand another person's emotions and needs and thoughts. It's one of the core competencies, actually, of emotional intelligence and is a critical leadership skill. So those who are highly empathetic are able to pick up on emotional cues. They can appreciate not only what a person is saying, but also why they are saying it. They understand where a person's feelings come from. So those that do not empathize have a tendency to misread the other person, right? And I love this definition of empathy. It's the art of stepping imaginatively into the shoes of another person, understanding their feelings and perspectives, and using that understanding to guide your own actions. So again, let's talk about what empathy is not, because it can often be confused with other human behavior. It is not sympathy. Sympathy is feeling pity or sorrow for someone else's misfortune. That's like saying she went to her best friend for sympathy. It's when you're seeking out that feeling of pity and sorrow. It's not compassion, right? Compassion is sympathetic consciousness of another person's distress, together with the desire to alleviate it. So that might sound like, my boss showed compassion when she allowed me to stay home so that I could care for my ill child. It's not empathy, though. And the last one is, last two actually, the last is agreement. Being empathetic is not just agreeing with someone. And it's also not the golden rule. And while the golden rule is an important one, it's not empathy. So the great news here, empathy can be learned and practiced and trained. And 98% of people can empathize, which is really great news. So let's give you some tips for empathy as well. And you'll notice that these tips I shared with you for active listening are the same ones for empathy. And all are based on seeking meaning rather than just being physically present and listening during a conversation. So use open-ended questions in the conversation. Seek stories from the person that helps illustrate the meaning of their narrative. Listen and watch for feelings and emotions so that you can detect feelings of sadness, excitement, or shifts in attitude. And you'll see experience and observe here as well. So while the last two are a bit more difficult to experience, there's real power in putting yourself in someone's physical situation so that you can empathize. or should the opportunity present itself, actually observing a situation to better understand the nuances at play. That would be really helpful, so it becomes firsthand experience to you. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of giving and accepting feedback in the workplace. So here's what we know about managers. When left without the proper tools to give feedback well, managers feel that giving feedback could potentially demotivate their team. They prefer to avoid giving feedback altogether. Sometimes managers feel that spending time on feedback is absolutely irrelevant to the work product, and most will agree that they feel overwhelmed and they see feedback as a daunting process. From the other side, we often hear that employees don't get feedback from their bosses enough, or that the idea of feedback stresses them out. So let's kick over to our next poll. When is the last time you received feedback? Within the last week? Within the last month? Within the last 3 to 6 months? Or within the last year? When is the last time you received feedback? Week, month, 3 to 6 months, or in the last year?
Okay, that was a quick and unanimous response from the audience. Oh, actually, some of the results are changing. People are changing their answers. So I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And Michele, what I can share with you is that 75% of our learners have received feedback within a week, and then the balance has received feedback 25% at C, 3 to 6 months.
So 75% in the last week.
Right.
Great. That's awesome. You guys are already in awesome situations and are feedback superheroes. That's awesome to hear. So something else to consider when giving and receiving feedback is that our personality type plays a significant role in how we deliver and process feedback. So we will review Myers-Briggs. However, there are plenty of other personality leadership tests out there that can also help illustrate this idea. So I just find this fascinating. So this is a map of all of the different personality types within Myers-Briggs. So, for example, let's just explore the top two in the top row to the right, INFJ and INTJ. Both of these people would prefer to hear feedback in different ways. The INFJ seeks harmony and cooperation, while the INTJ is more logical and reserved. So you can imagine that during a conversation where you're providing work feedback to an INFJ, they'll want to know that there's an opportunity to improve, to smooth things over. They'll need to be made comfortable that this is just a bump in the road that will pass, right? And the INTJ, for example, will want backup. They'll want documentation. They'll need to hear factual supporting statements to understand the feedback more holistically. So at the end of this, I'll be sharing this presentation with all of you. So I encourage you to spend a bit more time with this piece to understand where you might fall into this matrix, and also where those around you might fall into the matrix so that you can tailor your own feedback. Interestingly, our generation also plays a key role in how we like to engage in workplace conversation. So let's start with traditionalists. These are people in the workforce that are currently over the age of 70, right? These people like public recognition, and when they're engaging with the boss, they believe that no news is good news. If they don't hear anything from anybody, they assume everything is going well, right? They're straightforward, they're tactful, and they listen more than contribute. So encouraging these folks to participate in conversation is always a good idea. Compared to baby boomers. Now, these are the people currently in the workforce who are between the ages of 50 to 70. They like public recognition, but they have a high need for control. So providing effective feedback helps them feel in control of what to work on and how to work on it. And they require more feedback than the older generation. They dislike conflict, but they value personal growth. So therefore, any constructive feedback should be approached as a growth opportunity for these folks. 360 feedback is welcomed, and without regular feedback, boomers will ask for it or interpret their situation around them. So if they're, for example, invited to a meeting, they'll assume that everything is going well. But if they're left out of the meeting, they'll assume that something's going wrong, which will differ greatly to Generation X. Now, Generation X are folks that are in their mid-30s to about 50 currently. This is where meaning starts to play a big role in feedback in the workplace, right? This generation is motivated to understand how they're contributing to the overall organization's success. So when we're giving them feedback, it should include how their own progress impacts the company. They want ongoing recognition. They ask for feedback. They're constant learners. So feedback can be presented in ways that offer opportunities to grow and develop. Without feedback, this generation starts looking for other opportunities, just like that. So more than any other, this generation will find the void with negatives and quickly move to protect themselves personally and their own brand. And often that comes in the form of finding a new job. So you can tell with this generation, if they're not receiving feedback, you could experience a lot of turnover because they're already looking for new roles. And then the millennial generation, so these folks currently range from late teenage years to mid-30s, right? And you can see that this is a real transformational and awesome generation. So while there's a lot published about the millennial generation, I think what would be best is education on how this group of people would like to experience their work life, right? So due to constantly engaging, social has a huge impact because this generation is receiving feedback all the time. More than any other generation, these folks crave positive reinforcement and they want to be validated about their contribution to the company. And to address their needs, daily feedback is necessary, positive or constructive. So holding feedback until the next scheduled meeting is never a good idea. And what I think is really interesting and positive here is that this generation is just as likely to provide feedback and opinions as they are to seek it out. Millennials, in the absence of feedback, will assume everything is okay because in their world, if it's not okay, you get told how to course correct. So let's practice. Let's practice giving feedback, right? Regardless of generation or personality type, here are the keys to the kingdom on how to give feedback, right? Have it be timely, direct, clear, impact-driven, and goals-oriented. My recommendation is if you have feedback, be it around work or how a meeting went or on someone's performance, ask if you can give someone feedback first. State your intention that you have feedback. Describe the specific observed behavior or outcome and be specific and clear. Only use factual information and I language. If you are providing someone feedback, own the feedback and say, I have observed that X, Y, or Z has happened. And communicate the impact. What is the impact of this person's presence in a meeting or poor performance or great work product with a client, right? What is the impact to you, to the team, to the targets, to their coworkers? And at the end of you providing feedback, ask for their feedback. What are their thoughts on what they're hearing? Be honest, be straightforward, and be respectful. And just like the last sections, I thought I would provide some common feedback traps. So the first is accusations. We briefly reviewed this earlier. Typically, these come in the form of starting sentences with the word you. You didn't review this work before sharing it with the client. You always talk over people. This leads the listener to get defensive, and the conversation's meaning doesn't grow. It causes the listener to not want to participate or improve. Floodgating, I think, is something that happens often, right? This is where we save up all of the feedback and spill it at one time, right? Because we've been nervous, or we've not been encouraged to provide the feedback, and then all of a sudden it gets to a fever pitch and we come out with all of the feedback at one time. The last is softness, right? Where softening up the message often lacks direction and clarity. In these situations, the person receiving the feedback is not really sure what to do next, or how this feedback impacts their team or the client's work. And then the last is impulsiveness. Not being thoughtful about how you provide feedback is cause of 99% of the issues in workplace conversation that come up. So take the time to work out your approach to giving feedback. So here are some tips on how to do that, right? Anticipate when a good time would be to share the feedback. Set expectations that you have feedback to share. Be concise and factual. Share why you believe this is important. Ask for the person's point of view. And remember that people want to hear it straight in an empathetic way. So if we wrap all of this up, this would sound something like, Michele, do you have a moment? I have some feedback on that client meeting that I'd like to discuss with you. When the creative team was presenting their last idea, I noticed you were on your phone. This led the client to be distracted and looking at you rather than engaging with the presentation. This is important because I know you all worked very hard at getting the work to the place it is today, and ensuring the client hears the idea completely is key to us selling it in. What did you think about that meeting? Do you have any feedback on the situation as well? So that's just one way to go about it, but certainly I'd love to, engage in further conversation afterwards if you'd like some further tips on how to go about this. And then I think the last part that's important to talk about is accepting feedback. At KVS, we're spending a lot of time on this actually, and we're spending time on training people to receive feedback gracefully, which is really, really difficult. And I think we can all agree that we have felt these three things when we hear feedback about our work or our performance, right? We can get defensive, we can get upset, or we walk away unclear, right? There could be tears, there could be turning red, there could be shutting down and not engaging in the conversation. And then there's the worst part of just walking away and not sure, what you should do with this information. So my advice to you, and this is the last slide that we'll review, is think about this when you hear feedback next time. Take a breath, withhold your initial reaction, and remember how important feedback is to your career success and to the company's success. Actively listen, be engaged, pay attention to the environment, understand the nuances of the feedback. Say thank you, and if you're prepared in that moment, ask questions calmly if you're ready, but only if you're ready. And if you're not, ask for time to process the feedback, and then request time to follow up, to have a further discussion on a different day or within a couple of hours after you've had the opportunity to process it. So with that, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I encourage you to find me. Again, my Twitter handle is @MichelleMProta. And, I think we can hand it over to the lovely team at the 4As to open up for questions now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michele, for those insights and those actionable tips that I'm sure our listeners will be able to take back and apply today and at their jobs. So everyone on the phone, we are now in the Q&A portion of the webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, please send in any questions. Just go to the question box at the bottom of your GoTo panel and type and submit them in. And Michele, to start us off, we've got a couple of questions here that I'll kick over to you. If I am providing feedback to someone and don't believe the feedback is resonating, what do you recommend I do?
This happens a lot. Thank you for your question. if I notice that feedback is not resonating, I often take my time and I give the person an opportunity to just process this. So what I will say is, I know that this is a lot to take in, and I'm happy to provide you some time. So why don't we catch up tomorrow after you've had an opportunity to think through it and review it. And then the next day, I follow up again to have the conversation, but mostly look for the opposite person to talk, because it's really important to understand what they heard, because often what we say is not what is heard. So I ask the person to speak about what they think they heard and resolve it that way. If that doesn't work, then I often follow up in an email to reiterate the conversation that we had, to provide a North Star in writing rather than just by way of conversation.
Great, thank you. We have another question. I get really nervous every time I hear feedback, regardless of whether I'm prepared or caught off guard. What are some tricks you have to becoming a feedback ninja?
That's understandable. That's understandable. I think the key here, right, and thank you for your question, the key here is to remember that feedback is for improvement. So know that the person providing you feedback is doing it in hopes that there's improvement to support you and be involved in that solution. So it can be overwhelming, and that's very common, but take a breath, listen, take notes if you have to, and always ask for time to process. There is never a requirement to respond on the spot. Say thank you, write down your notes, and ask for time in the next 24 to 48 hours to have a further conversation. And certainly, if you feel yourself getting red or blotchy, I think wearing a scarf or a turtleneck is always helpful.
Works for me. We have another question that came in. I'm going to read it. I find opening up the feedback conversation to be the most difficult. What are some ways to give someone the heads up that you're about to provide feedback?
I think we can use some of the openers that we talked about earlier on in the presentation. Thank you for that. It's always about setting expectations and giving people the heads up. So I don't recommend ever doing this in passing. I recommend being face-to-face when possible. And I always recommend opening up the conversation by saying, are you open to hearing some feedback on X? The client meeting, the work review, how that last project went, and gauge their reaction. Most often people will say sure and yes, but I think if we're thinking about body language, if someone tends to get nervous when you ask that question, I would just ensure that you are delivering the message in a way that you know will resonate rather than having that person become overcome with emotion.
Good. Thank you. Looks like there's one last question here. What are good questions to ask when practicing active listening?
So I think thank you for that question. I think the first thing to try is always asking the word why, right? So imagine that someone tells you that they went skydiving for the first time this weekend. Active listening questions level up the conversation. And by leveling up, I mean provide more meaning to the conversation. So you might ask questions like, how long have you thought about skydiving before? What did it feel like? Why did you choose to go in the location that you chose to go, right? So once you start the conversation and there seems to be an energy and some movement there, you could always tack on the word why. When someone says something, follow up with why, without it ever becoming an interrogation. I think the why trick is a really great place to start.
Perfect. And I think that's it for our questions, Michele. So I'd just like to say again a huge thank you to you for being here with us today. It was a pleasure having you. And while this is the last session in our Mastering Workplace Conversations series, you can still get access to any of the previous sessions. For any questions, email us at webinar@aaa.org. And to get access to this deck, all you need to do is fill out our survey, which will come and land right in your inbox right after this webinar. It'll take you no more than 2 minutes, we promise. And once you have that filled out, you will receive a link to the deck. So thank you, Michele, and thank you to our participants today. We hope you have a great rest of the day and look forward to training with you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.